Karen Whitfield stepped out of her pearl-white Mercedes-Benz, her heels clicking sharply against the cobblestone driveway of Whitfield Manor. The sun shone brilliantly, casting its golden light over the sprawling estate, but Karen barely noticed. She was already preoccupied with the day ahead: brunch with the country club ladies, an art auction in the afternoon, and, if time permitted, a charity gala in the evening. Her life was meticulously curated, a glittering facade of privilege and purpose, and she had no intention of looking beyond its polished veneer. The Whitfield name carried weight in society. Karen's father, Richard Whitfield, had built an empire of opulent skyscrapers and luxurious neighborhoods, while her mother, Eleanor, was a celebrated philanthropist, lauded for her work with high-profile charities. Karen had inherited not just their sharp features and commanding presence but also their deeply entrenched beliefs about who belonged in their world and who did not. Karen prided herself on her discipline and sophistication. Every element of her appearance, from the perfect blowout of her honey-blonde hair to the delicate Cartier bracelet on her wrist, was carefully chosen to reflect her status. Yet, beneath the polished exterior lay a narrow worldview shaped by privilege and reinforced by the echo chamber of her social circles. As Karen stepped onto the busy sidewalk of Madison Avenue that morning, she felt a flicker of irritation at the hustle and bustle of city life. People rushed past her, their faces a blur of indifference. She adjusted her designer sunglasses, her perfectly manicured fingers brushing against the cool metal frames. She was on her way to her favorite boutique, a place where the world outside faded into the background of curated luxury. It was her sanctuary, a place where she never had to think about the lives of those who couldn't afford the things she took for granted. His head slightly, a faint, humorless smile tugging at his lips. "Of course you do." The dismissive but as she turned the corner onto 34th Street, her insulated reality cracked. John Williams sat cross-legged on the cold pavement, his back pressed against the weathered stone wall of a high-end boutique. His graying hair, cropped short beneath a battered veteran's cap, framed a face etched with lines of hardship and resilience. Beside him, a piece of cardboard rested against his knee, bearing a simple message: "Homeless vet. Anything helps. God bless." Karen's stride faltered when her eyes landed on him. The sight jarred her, not because she hadn't seen homelessness before, but because of the way he looked at her. His gaze was steady, unyielding, and utterly devoid of the shame she unconsciously expected. It was as if he saw through her polished exterior, past the wealth and privilege, straight to the heart of who she was. Karen's initial instinct was to ignore him. She tightened her grip on her leather handbag and averted her gaze, quickening her pace. But just as she was about to pass him, John's voice cut through the air. He said, his tone calm but firm. "A moment of your time." Karen froze mid-step. It wasn't the plea she had anticipated. It was a challenge, unspoken but undeniable. Slowly, she turned to face him, her perfectly arched eyebrows lifting in incredulity. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice laced with impatience and something else she couldn't quite place, discomfort, perhaps. She hated confrontation, especially from people she deemed beneath her notice. John's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not asking for money," he said simply. "I just want to know, why do people like you look at people like me like we're invisible?" The question hit Karen like a slap, unexpected and stinging. "Excuse me," she replied, her voice sharp, though it wavered slightly. "You heard me," John said, his voice steady, his eyes piercing. "You walk past like I'm not even here. Why?" Karen felt a flicker of indignation rise within her. How dare he speak to her like that? She was Karen Whitfield, a woman of standing, someone who had worked tirelessly to maintain her image and status. This man, sitting in tattered clothes on a dirty sidewalk, had no right to question her. "I don't have time for this," she said curtly, her polished tone a shield against the discomfort bubbling within her. "I have somewhere to be." John tilted eagerness in his tone cut through her defenses like a scalpel. For a moment, Karen couldn't think of a response. She shook her head as if to shake off the encounter and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement with a determined finality. John watched her retreating figure, his expression unreadable. It wasn't the first time he had seen someone like her, a person so wrapped up in their own privilege that they couldn't see the humanity in others. But there had been something different about her reaction. She had hesitated, if only for a moment. That hesitation told him she wasn't entirely immune to the reality she tried so hard to ignore. John's own reality had once been different. He had worn the uniform with pride, serving his country with honor. But the war had taken its toll, leaving behind scars that no one seemed to care about. The promises of support and reintegration had crumbled beneath the weight of bureaucracy, leaving him to fend for himself. Now, the streets were his home, the cardboard sign his voice. Back in her car, Karen gripped the steering wheel tightly, her manicured nails digging into the leather. The encounter with John had unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. She prided herself on her composure, but his words had struck a nerve. Why do people like you look at people like me like we're invisible? The question replayed in her mind, gnawing at her. She had always thought of herself as kind and generous, but in truth, her kindness was transactional, her generosity performative. She donated to causes that kept people like John at a comfortable distance, never questioning the systems that allowed such inequality to persist. As the city streets blurred past her, Karen caught a glimpse of her reflection in the rearview mirror. For the first time in years, she didn't like what she saw. Beneath the flawless makeup and the carefully curated image, she saw cracks, a version of herself she had been too afraid to confront. Karen didn't know it yet, but that fleeting moment on the sidewalk marked the beginning of a journey she hadn't planned for. It was a journey that would challenge her beliefs, shatter her illusions, and force her to see the world, and herself, in a way she never had before. The rhythmic hum of Karen's Mercedes as it glided through the city streets did little to drown out the noise in her head. Her thoughts raced, replaying the brief but searing encounter with the homeless man. His words echoed in her mind with unsettling clarity, like a sharp note that refused to fade. Why do people like you look at people like me like we're invisible? It was a simple question, but the weight of it pressed down on her chest. She had encountered homeless people countless times before, and she always reacted the same way, with indifference. It was what people in her world did, averted their eyes, clutched their purses tighter, and walked faster. It was easier to pretend they didn't exist. Karen tried to shake the memory, clinging to rationalizations that had always comforted her. I give to charity. I support shelters. Isn't that enough? But the excuses felt hollow now, their edges fraying under the scrutiny of her own conscience. As she parked her car in front of the boutique, Karen stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her features, flawless and carefully groomed, betrayed no hint of the turmoil inside. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. For the first time in years, she found herself questioning the foundations of her carefully constructed world. A few blocks away, John Williams sat on the cold pavement, his back pressed against the unforgiving wall of the boutique. The morning sun had given way to a cloudy sky, and a chill settled in the air. John pulled his threadbare jacket tighter around his shoulders, trying to ward off the creeping cold. The streets had taught John many lessons, none of them easy. Each day was a battle for survival, a relentless cycle of seeking food, shelter, and dignity in a world that often offered none. But the hardest battles weren't fought on the streets, they were fought in his mind. John had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, a soldier in the prime of his life, full of purpose and pride. But the war had left scars that went far deeper than the shrapnel wounds on his body. The memories of his time in combat haunted him, resurfacing in vivid flashes and sleepless nights. The sound of gunfire, the cries of his comrades, the weight of loss, these were his constant companions. PTSD had stolen much from John, his peace of mind, his ability to hold down a job, his connections to the life he once knew. The world he returned to after the war seemed alien, indifferent to the sacrifices he had made. The promises of support and reintegration had crumbled into bureaucratic red tape, leaving him to navigate a harsh and unforgiving reality alone. Despite everything, John refused to give up. He carried himself with a quiet dignity, determined not to let the world define him by his circumstances. He knew he was more than the cardboard sign by his side, more than the tired body wrapped in a worn jacket. But on days like this, when the cold seeped into his bones and the weight of the world felt unbearable, it was hard to hold on to that belief. At the boutique, Karen moved through the aisles, her hands brushing against racks of designer clothing. But her usual enthusiasm for shopping had waned. Her mind kept wandering back to the man on the sidewalk. She tried to push the memory aside, telling herself that it wasn't her problem. "He's not my responsibility. I can't fix everyone's problems." And yet, the memory of his steady gaze lingered, piercing through her defenses. He hadn't asked for money or pity. He had asked for something far more disarming, acknowledgement. Karen frowned as she picked up a silk scarf, its vibrant colors suddenly seeming garish. She prided herself on being a good person, didn't she? She donated to charities, attended fundraisers, and supported causes that helped the less fortunate. But deep down, she knew those actions were more about appearances than genuine care. She gave because it was expected, because it reinforced her image as a compassionate member of the elite. But what had she actually done for people like him? The thought unsettled her, and she quickly left the boutique, her shopping bags lighter than usual. Meanwhile, on the sidewalk where John sat, a familiar figure approached. Officer Rodriguez, a patrolman with the NYPD, was well known in the area. Unlike many others in his position, Rodriguez carried himself with a quiet compassion that set him apart. "Morning, John," Rodriguez said, crouching down to meet John's eye level. He held out a steaming cup of coffee and a bag containing a sandwich. "How are you holding up today?" John managed a faint smile as he accepted the offering. "Same as always," he said. "But this helps." "Thanks, officer." Rodriguez nodded, his expression kind but tinged with concern. He had seen too many people like John fall through the cracks, forgotten by a system that was supposed to protect them. He couldn't change the world, but he believed in small acts of kindness. To him, John wasn't just another homeless man. He was a person with a story, a life that mattered. "Let me know if you need anything," Rodriguez said, standing up. "The shelter on 42nd still has beds open tonight if you want me to give them a call." John shook his head. "Thanks, but I'll manage." Rodriguez hesitated, then nodded. "Take care of yourself, John. And remember, you're not invisible." The words lingered in John's mind as Rodriguez walked away. They were a stark contrast to the indifference he was used to. For a brief moment, he felt seen. As Karen drove home, she couldn't help but notice the homeless encampments beneath the overpasses and the figures huddled in doorways. She had seen them 1,000 times before, but today, they seemed different. She wondered about their stories, their struggles, their lives beyond the cardboard signs. Her chest tightened as she thought of John again. What had his life been like before he ended up on the streets? What had he sacrificed, and what had he lost? The questions unsettled her, poking holes in the comfortable narrative she had always believed, that people were responsible for their own circumstances, that success was a matter of hard work and determination. For the first time, Karen began to see the world through a different lens, not as a series of neat categories but as a web of interconnected lives. The realization was uncomfortable, but it was also undeniable. Neither Karen nor John knew it yet, but their lives were on a collision course. Karen's growing discomfort and curiosity would lead her to question everything she thought she knew, while John's quiet resilience would challenge her to see the world, and herself, in a new light. And at the heart of it all, Officer Rodriguez's small act of kindness would serve as a reminder that sometimes, the smallest gestures could spark the biggest changes. Karen Whitfield sat in her study that evening, the soft glow of a designer lamp casting light across the elegant oak desk where she often reviewed charity event plans or composed thank you notes to her social circle. But tonight, the familiar tasks held no appeal. Her thoughts remained tethered to the encounter earlier that day, the man on the sidewalk with eyes that seemed to pierce through her, challenging her carefully curated sense of self. She sipped her herbal tea, but it tasted bitter on her tongue. Karen had spent years cocooned in a world where success and failure were easily explained, where those who struggled had simply failed to make the right choices. Yet the memory of John, sitting there with quiet dignity, had begun to unravel that certainty. The weight of his question, "Why do people like you look at people like me like we're invisible?" hung heavily in her mind. It wasn't just a question, it was a mirror held up to her own indifference. Karen's laptop rested on the desk. With a mix of curiosity and discomfort, she opened it and began typing. She searched for information about homelessness among veterans, clicking through articles and reports that painted a grim picture. Thousands of men and women who had served their country with honor were now forgotten, abandoned by a system that had promised them support. Words like PTSD, job instability, and housing insecurity jumped out at her. The numbers were staggering, but it was the personal stories that struck her hardest. Tales of soldiers returning home to find themselves strangers in their own land, battling demons no one could see and fighting to survive in a society that had moved on without them. Karen leaned back in her chair, a knot forming in her stomach. She thought about her own life, the ease with which she had navigated the world, never once considering the privilege that cushioned her. John's face appeared in her mind again, his steady gaze a stark contrast to the desperation she had expected. He wasn't invisible, not to her. Not anymore. The next morning, Karen found herself walking toward the corner of Madison Avenue and 34th Street. She had no plan, no idea what she would say or do if she saw him again. All she knew was that she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to understand. The thought of approaching him made her stomach churn with nervous energy, but she told herself it was a small step, one she owed herself as much as him. When she turned the corner, there he was, sitting in the same spot as before. His veteran's cap was pulled low over his forehead, and his jacket looked even thinner against the brisk morning air. Karen hesitated, standing a few feet away, her designer coat feeling suddenly too warm and too conspicuous. She was about to turn back when John looked up, his sharp eyes meeting hers. "You again," he said, his tone neutral but curious. Karen took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the strap of her handbag. I just wanted to say hello," she said, the words sounding awkward and hollow even to her own ears. John raised an eyebrow. "Hello," he replied, his voice carrying a hint of skepticism. Karen swallowed hard, her carefully rehearsed lines evaporating in the face of his calm scrutiny. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," she admitted. "About being invisible." John's expression softened slightly, though he didn't reply immediately. He gestured to the spot next to him. "You're welcome to sit if you want," he said, his tone neither inviting nor dismissive. Karen hesitated, glancing at the ground. The pavement looked cold and unwelcoming, but the thought of refusing felt worse. She lowered herself carefully, her coat brushing against the rough concrete, and sat beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city buzzed around them, cars honking and pedestrians rushing past, but the noise seemed distant, muted by the tension of their shared silence. "Why are you here?" John asked finally, his voice low but steady. Karen hesitated, searching for an answer that wouldn't sound condescending or insincere. "I guess. I wanted to understand," she said. "To understand you." John let out a dry laugh. "Understand me? Why would someone like you care about someone like me?" Karen flinched at the words, their bluntness cutting through her fragile resolve. "Because I don't think it's fair," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "What's happened to you? I mean, I read about veterans and homelessness last night, and it doesn't make sense. How someone who served their country could end up like this." John's face tightened, the faintest flicker of anger flashing in his eyes. "You think I don't know that?" he said, his voice rising slightly. "You think I haven't asked myself that question 1,000 times?" Karen felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. "I didn't mean it like that," she said quickly. I don't know what it's like. And I want to." John studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching hers for sincerity. Finally, he sighed, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "You want to know? Fine. Here's the truth. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan. Saw things you wouldn't believe. Lost friends, good men who didn't deserve to die. And when I came back, I couldn't sleep. Couldn't hold down a job. The VA. They'll tell you they help, but good luck getting through the paperwork or finding someone who actually cares." He paused, his hands clenching into fists. "You give everything for your country, and when you come home, you're just discarded. Like you don't matter anymore." Karen listened, her chest tightening with every word. She had read similar stories the night before, but hearing it from John made it real in a way no article ever could. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I had no idea it was like that." John shrugged, the movement heavy with resignation. "Most people don't." As they sat in silence, Karen noticed a figure approaching from down the street. It was Officer Rodriguez, his uniform crisp and his expression warm as he carried a bag and a cup of coffee. "Morning, John," he said, handing him the items with a smile. "And good morning to you," he added, nodding politely to Karen. Karen returned the nod, watching as John thanked Rodriguez with a quiet sincerity. The officer lingered for a moment, glancing between the two of them. "Good to see you're making friends, John," he said lightly before tipping his hat and walking away. Karen looked after him, a question forming on her lips. "He seems kind." John nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. "Rodriguez is one of the good ones. He treats us like people, not problems." Karen felt a pang of guilt at the words, realizing how often she had done exactly that, seen people like John as problems to be avoided rather than individuals to be understood. The realization was uncomfortable, but it also felt like a step forward, however small. As the morning stretched on, Karen and John talked, haltingly at first, but with growing ease. She asked questions, and he answered them with a mix of honesty and guardedness, revealing pieces of his life that she could barely comprehend. And as she listened, Karen felt something shift within her, a crack widening in the foundation of her old beliefs. The next time Karen visited John, it was a brisk afternoon, the kind where the wind carried a hint of winter's approach. She had spent the morning rehearsing what she might say, hoping to show him she wasn't there out of pity or curiosity alone. But as she approached his usual spot, she noticed something different. John was standing this time, his arms folded tightly across his chest, speaking to a young woman who looked both angry and heartbroken. Karen hesitated, unsure if she should interrupt, but her curiosity anchored her to the sidewalk. The woman, who appeared to be in her late 20s, had her arms crossed and was leaning slightly away from John as if trying to shield herself from whatever he was saying. "I told you I don't want anything from you," the woman said, her voice sharp but trembling. "You've got no right to act like you care now." John's shoulders slumped, and he looked at her with a weariness Karen hadn't seen before. "Sarah, I'm not trying to act like anything," he said, his voice softer than Karen expected. "I just want to talk. That's all. Talk." Sarah shot back, her voice rising. "Talk about what? How you disappeared for years? How you chose the bottle over your family? Or how you couldn't even bother to tell me you were living on the street?" John flinched, the words striking him like blows. He opened his mouth to respond but seemed to think better of it. Instead, he sighed heavily and rubbed the back of his neck. "I know I messed up," he said quietly. "I know I hurt you. But I'm trying to make it right." Sarah's expression wavered for a moment, but then her jaw tightened. "It's too late, Dad. You don't get to make it right. Not after everything." She turned abruptly and walked away, her steps quick and purposeful. John watched her go, his hand half lifting as if to stop her, but he let it fall back to his side. His shoulders sagged, and he lowered himself to the ground, staring at nothing in particular. Karen approached cautiously, her footsteps soft against the pavement. "Is everything okay?" she asked, though the answer was painfully obvious. John glanced up at her, his expression a mixture of frustration and sorrow. "That was my daughter," he said after a moment, his voice flat. "Sarah." Karen sat down beside him, waiting for him to continue. When he didn't, she hesitated before speaking. She seemed upset. John let out a bitter laugh. "That's putting it mildly. She has every right to be angry with me." Karen didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked in the direction Sarah had gone, a flicker of curiosity and sympathy stirring within her. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked finally. John exhaled deeply, his breath visible in the chilly air. "What's there to say? I wasn't there for her when she needed me. I let her down, time and time again. And now, she can't even look at me without seeing all the ways I failed." Karen hesitated, sensing there was more to the story. "Why weren't you there?" she asked gently. John didn't answer right away. He stared at the ground, his jaw working as he struggled to find the words. "After I came back from Afghanistan, I wasn't the same," he said finally. "I couldn't sleep. The nightmares, they were constant. I tried to push through it, to be the husband and father they needed, but I couldn't keep it together. I started drinking, trying to quiet the noise in my head, but that just made everything worse." He ran a hand over his face, the lines in his skin deepening. Sarah was just a kid back then. She didn't understand why her dad was always angry or why he'd disappear for days at a time. And I didn't have the strength to explain it to her. Eventually, my wife had enough. She took Sarah and left. I didn't blame her. I wouldn't have stayed with me, either. Karen listened, her heart aching as she began to see the man beneath the layers of regret and hardship. "Have you talked to her much since then?" she asked. John shook his head. "I tried a few times, but she didn't want to hear it. Can't say I blame her. I wasn't exactly father of the year. And now she's built a life of her own. She doesn't need me messing it up." Karen thought about Sarah's words, the raw pain in her voice, and how much she must have carried over the years. "It sounds like she's still hurting," she said. "Maybe that means she still cares." John looked at her, his eyes tired but thoughtful. "Maybe," he said softly. "Or maybe it just means I hurt her so badly she can't let it go." The conversation stayed with Karen long after she left. She couldn't stop thinking about Sarah, about the years of resentment she must have felt, and the complicated mix of love and pain that came with having a father like John. It was easy to see why she had pushed him away, but it was also clear that the distance hadn't erased her feelings. If anything, it had only deepened them. A few days later, Karen decided to reach out to Officer Rodriguez. She had seen the way he interacted with John and thought he might have some insight into how to help. When she explained the situation, Rodriguez listened carefully, his expression thoughtful. "John's a good man," he said. "He's been through a lot, and he's made his share of mistakes, but I've seen how hard he's trying to turn things around. If anyone deserves a second chance, it's him." Karen nodded. "But how do I help? I don't know Sarah, and I don't want to make things worse." Rodriguez smiled faintly. "Sometimes, the best way to help isn't by fixing things directly. It's by being there, by listening, and by showing people they're not alone. John's carrying a lot of weight on his shoulders, and knowing someone believes in him could make all the difference." Karen took his words to heart. Over the next few weeks, she continued to visit John, learning more about his life, his struggles, and his hopes. She listened as he talked about Sarah, about the little girl who used to run to him when he came home, her laughter like music in their small house. And she watched as his walls began to crack, revealing a man who wanted nothing more than to make amends. Through it all, Karen began to see the human cost of the struggles she had once dismissed. John wasn't just a homeless man on the street. He was a father, a veteran, and a person who had been let down by the very systems that were supposed to protect him. And Sarah wasn't just an estranged daughter. She was a woman carrying the scars of a broken relationship, struggling to reconcile her love for her father with the pain he had caused her. Karen hadn't expected to meet someone like Dave Martinez. She found him through a late-night internet search, buried in a local directory of veteran support services. His name appeared next to the title Veteran Advocate and a brief description of his work helping homeless veterans secure housing, navigate the labyrinth of benefits, and rebuild their lives. On a whim, and fueled by a growing need to do more than simply listen, Karen reached out. The next day, she found herself in a modest office in a less glamorous part of town. The walls were adorned with framed photos of military units, service medals, and posters encouraging veterans to reach out for help. Dave himself was a tall man in his early 40s, with a military precision to his movements and a warm, approachable demeanor. His dark eyes held a depth of understanding that Karen found both comforting and intimidating. "So," Dave said after she introduced herself and explained how she'd met John. "You want to help him? That's admirable. But I have to ask, what's in it for you?" The question caught Karen off guard. I don't know," she admitted. "I guess I just want to make a difference. Meeting John opened my eyes to things I hadn't thought about before. I want to do something meaningful." Dave studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. But helping someone like John isn't easy. There's a lot of history, a lot of pain, and a lot of work ahead. Are you ready for that?" Karen hesitated but then nodded firmly. "I think I am." "Good," Dave said with a small smile. "Let's start by understanding what John needs most right now." Over the next hour, Dave walked Karen through the challenges veterans like John faced. He explained the systemic barriers that kept many from accessing the help they needed, complex paperwork, long waiting lists, and the stigma surrounding mental health. He also talked about the emotional toll of homelessness and how it could erode a person's sense of self-worth, making it even harder to seek help. "John's story isn't unique," Dave said. "But that doesn't make it any less important. What he needs is support, not just from strangers, but from people who care about him. If you want to help him reconnect with his daughter, that's going to take patience and trust. It won't happen overnight." Karen left the office with a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time, she felt like she had a roadmap, a way to turn her desire to help into tangible action. She decided to start by talking to John about Dave and the services he offered. When Karen approached John that afternoon, she found him in the same spot, his cap pulled low against the chilly wind. He greeted her with a nod, his usual guarded demeanor softening slightly as she sat down beside him. "I met someone today," Karen began, unsure of how to broach the subject. "A man named Dave Martinez. He's a veteran advocate. He helps people like you get back on their feet." John raised an eyebrow. "People like me?" Karen flushed. "I didn't mean it like that. I just thought he might be able to help. He said he could help you navigate the system, maybe even find stable housing." John shook his head. "I've tried all that before. It's always the same. Too much red tape, not enough actual help." "I know it's frustrating," Karen said gently. "But this guy seems different. He cares, John. He really does. Will you at least meet him? For me?" John hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. After a long moment, he nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll meet him. But I'm not making any promises." The meeting with Dave was tentative at first, but it didn't take long for John to warm up to the advocate's straightforward approach. Dave treated John with respect, speaking to him as an equal rather than a case file. He listened intently as John shared his story, offering practical advice and a sense of hope that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome. Karen watched the interaction from the sidelines, her heart lifting as she saw John begin to open up. It was a small step, but it felt monumental, a crack of light breaking through the darkness that had surrounded him for so long. As John began working with Dave to explore housing options and access his benefits, Karen turned her attention to Sarah. She knew reconnecting them wouldn't be easy, but she also believed it was crucial for both of them. She reached out to Sarah cautiously, sending a message that explained who she was and why she was contacting her. To her surprise, Sarah agreed to meet. The young woman was hesitant and guarded when they met at a coffee shop a few days later. Sarah's resemblance to John was striking, though her sharp features were softened by an air of vulnerability. Karen began by thanking her for coming and then shared her perspective on John's efforts to rebuild his life. "I know he hurt you," Karen said gently. "And I can't imagine how hard that must have been. But I've seen how much he wants to make things right. He's trying, Sarah. He really is." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked them back quickly. "It's not that simple," she said. "He left us when I needed him most. How do you just forgive that?" "You don't have to forgive him right away," Karen said. "But maybe you can give him a chance to show you he's changed." Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring into her coffee. Finally, she nodded. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I can promise." For the next few weeks, Karen juggled her efforts to support John and build a bridge to Sarah. She spent hours with John, learning more about his life, his regrets, and his hopes for the future. She also stayed in touch with Sarah, sharing updates and encouraging her to take small steps toward reconciliation. Through it all, Karen felt herself changing. The woman who had once walked past John without a second thought was gone, replaced by someone who saw him not as a problem to be solved but as a person worth knowing. Her empathy deepened with each passing day, and she found a sense of purpose she hadn't realized she was missing. When Sarah finally agreed to meet John, it was a chilly afternoon in the park. Karen stood off to the side with Dave, watching as father and daughter sat together on a bench. Their conversation was hesitant, filled with long pauses and uncertain glances, but it was a start, a fragile thread of connection that might one day become something stronger. As Karen watched them, she felt a swell of pride and hope. Helping John had started as an act of curiosity, but it had become something much deeper. In trying to change his life, she had also changed her own. And for the first time in years, she felt like she was truly making a difference. The autumn afternoon was still, the kind of day where the air felt heavy with anticipation. Karen Whitfield stood at the edge of the park, her hands clasped tightly together as she watched John pace near a wooden bench beneath a towering oak tree. His shoulders were hunched against the chill, but his movements betrayed a nervous energy she hadn't seen before. "Do you think she'll come?" John asked, stopping to look at Karen. His voice was calm, but his eyes gave him away. There was hope there, fragile and desperate, but it was buried under layers of fear. Karen gave him a reassuring smile, though her own nerves mirrored his. "She said she would. Just give her time." John nodded, his hands slipping into the pockets of his jacket. He glanced at the bench, then at the path leading through the park. Every passing minute felt like an eternity. Karen had worked tirelessly over the past weeks to get to this moment. She'd had countless conversations with Sarah, listening as the young woman poured out her pain and anger. Each session had been like peeling back the layers of an old wound, exposing raw emotions that had long been buried. Sarah had told Karen about the nights she stayed awake as a child, waiting for her father to come home. About the broken promises and the missed birthdays. About how it felt to love someone who always seemed to choose something else, alcohol, distance, silence, over her. But Karen had also seen glimmers of something else in Sarah's words, the longing for connection, for closure, for the father she had loved so fiercely when she was a little girl. Karen had gently encouraged Sarah to confront those feelings, to allow herself the possibility of healing. And now, here they were. When Sarah finally appeared, walking hesitantly down the path, Karen let out a small breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. John saw her too, and for a moment, he froze, his breath catching in his throat. Then, slowly, he stepped toward her. Sarah stopped a few feet away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked at her father with an expression Karen couldn't quite read, part anger, part sadness, and something else that might have been hope. "Hi," John said, his voice rough. "Thanks for coming." Sarah nodded, but she didn't say anything. Karen lingered at a respectful distance, wanting to give them privacy but ready to step in if needed. Dave Martinez had told her to expect this moment to be messy, and he'd been right. Reconciliation wasn't a straight line, it was a tangle of emotions that would take time to unravel. John cleared his throat, his hands twitching at his sides. "I know I'm the last person you probably want to see," he said. "And I don't blame you for that. But I've been trying, Sarah. I've been trying to get my life together. And I just want you to know that." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice was calm when she spoke. "Why now, Dad? Why not years ago, when I needed you?" John flinched, the words hitting him like a blow. He looked down at the ground, his shoulders sagging. "Because I was a coward," he admitted. "Because I was so wrapped up in my own pain that I couldn't see yours. And by the time I realized what I'd done, I thought it was too late." There was a long silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Karen watched as Sarah's expression softened, just a little. She wasn't ready to forgive, but she was listening. "You hurt me," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "You hurt Mom. Do you even know what it was like for us? Watching you fall apart and not being able to do anything about it." John's eyes glistened, and he nodded. "I do," he said quietly. "And I hate myself for it every day. If I could go back and change it, I would. But I can't. All I can do now is try to be better." Karen felt a lump form in her throat. She had heard John speak about his regrets before, but this was different. This was raw and unfiltered, a man laying bare his soul in front of the person he had hurt most. It was humility in its purest form, and it was heartbreaking to witness. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, her expression conflicted. "You say you're trying to be better," she said finally. "But how do I know you won't disappear again?" John straightened slightly, his jaw tightening with determination. "You don't," he said. "All I can do is show you. Day by day, moment by moment. I'm not asking you to trust me right away, but I'm asking for the chance to earn it." Karen stepped forward then, sensing the moment needed a gentle nudge. "Sarah," she said softly, "I know it's hard to believe him after everything you've been through. But I've seen how hard he's working to change. He's not the same person he was back then." Sarah glanced at Karen, her eyes filled with doubt and curiosity. "Why do you even care?" she asked. "You don't even know us." Karen hesitated, the question cutting straight to the heart of her own transformation. "Because I've realized that people like me have spent too long looking the other way," she said. "And because I believe that everyone deserves a second chance, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Sarah's gaze lingered on Karen for a moment before shifting back to John. Her arms slowly dropped to her sides, and she let out a shaky breath. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said. "Not yet. But I'm willing to try." John's face crumpled, and he took a step closer, his voice breaking. "That's all I could ever ask for." They stood there, father and daughter, two people bound by love and pain, reaching tentatively toward something that might one day be whole again. Karen watched with a mixture of pride and relief, knowing that this moment, messy, imperfect, and profoundly human, was the beginning of something new. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The crisp winter sun shone down on the park, casting long shadows across the ground. Karen Whitfield stood by a podium, her voice steady as she addressed a small but attentive crowd. Behind her was a banner that read, "Building Bridges, Supporting Veterans and Their Families." It was her first public event as an advocate for homeless veterans, and she felt a surge of pride and determination as she glanced at the people gathered to listen. "This isn't just about statistics or policies," Karen said, her voice carrying over the murmuring crowd. "It's about people, fathers, mothers, sons, daughters. People like John Williams, who served our country with honor and came home to a system that let him down. It's about ensuring that no one is invisible." She caught John's eye in the audience and saw him give her a small, encouraging nod. He stood tall and confident, wearing a crisp jacket that Dave Martinez had helped him pick out. Beside him was Sarah, who had taken to attending these events with him, her quiet presence a testament to the fragile but growing bond between them. John's journey had been far from easy, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had a direction. With Dave's help, he had secured a small apartment through a veterans' housing program. It wasn't much, but it was his, a space to call his own, free from the uncertainty of the streets. He'd also begun attending therapy sessions to address his PTSD, a step he'd avoided for years out of fear and pride. The most unexpected part of his new life, however, was Sarah. Their first meetings after the park had been tentative, filled with long silences and awkward exchanges. But slowly, those silences had given way to shared memories, hesitant laughter, and the beginnings of trust. Sarah wasn't ready to forgive everything, but she was willing to try, and that was more than John had ever hoped for. One evening, as they sat together in his apartment, Sarah had asked him a question that stayed with him. "What do you want to do now, Dad?" she'd said. "What's next?" John had stared at her for a moment, the question catching him off guard. For so long, his life had been about survival. Now, with a roof over his head and the beginnings of a support system, he realized he could think about something more. "I want to help others like me," he'd said finally. People who feel like they've been forgotten. If I can help even one person find their way back, it'll be worth it. Sarah had smiled at him then, a genuine smile that lit up her face in a way that reminded him of the little girl she used to be. I think that's a good idea, she'd said. And for the first time, John felt like he had a purpose beyond his own struggles. Karen watched John's transformation with a sense of awe and gratitude. She often reflected on how far she'd come herself. The woman who had once walked past John without a second glance had been replaced by someone who saw the world, and her place in it, very differently. She had used her resources and connections to start a non-profit dedicated to supporting veterans and their families, working closely with Dave to ensure the organization addressed real, practical needs. Her work wasn't just about raising funds, it was about building relationships. She spent hours visiting shelters, talking to veterans, and listening to their stories. She'd learned that the greatest gift she could give wasn't her money but her time and empathy. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when the weight of the stories she heard threatened to overwhelm her, but it was worth it. Karen's transformation hadn't gone unnoticed by her social circle. Some of her friends dismissed her new passion as a phase, but others were inspired by her commitment and began volunteering or donating to her cause. Little by little, she saw the ripple effects of her choices spreading outward. Officer Rodriguez leaned against his patrol car, watching the crowd in the park as Karen finished her speech. He felt a quiet pride as he saw John standing there, surrounded by people who believed in him. Rodriguez had known from the moment he met John that he was someone worth helping. There was a quiet strength in him, a resilience that had refused to be extinguished despite everything he'd endured. All it had taken was a small act of kindness, a cup of coffee, a few words of encouragement, to remind John that he wasn't invisible. The officer thought about the other people he'd helped over the years, the ones who had slipped through the cracks of society but had found their way back through small moments of compassion. He knew he couldn't change the world, but he also knew that wasn't the point. Change happened one person at a time, one act at a time. And sometimes, that was enough. As the event wound down, Karen joined John and Sarah by the refreshments table. She handed John a cup of coffee and smiled. "You did great today," she said. "I saw you talking to that group of veterans earlier. They seemed really interested in your story." John shrugged, but there was a glint of pride in his eyes. "I just told them the truth. If my mistakes can help someone else avoid them, then maybe they were worth something." Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she said softly. Karen felt a lump rise in her throat at the sight of them. She thought about the journey that had brought them all to this moment, about how a single encounter on a busy sidewalk had set off a chain of events that none of them could have predicted. It was a reminder that even the smallest actions could have profound consequences. As they stood together, the winter sun dipping lower in the sky, Karen felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had found a purpose beyond the shallow comforts of her old life, and she knew she would never go back. Helping John had changed her, but it had also changed him, Sarah, and even those who had witnessed their story. In the end, it wasn't just about fixing what was broken. It was about building something new, something stronger, something kinder, something that could withstand the weight of the world. The crisp air of early spring carried a sense of renewal through the city, a quiet reminder that even the coldest winters eventually give way to warmer days. The park where John had first reconnected with Sarah was alive with activity, children laughing, joggers passing by, and families enjoying the sunshine. It was here, beneath the familiar oak tree, that Karen Whitfield, John Williams, and Sarah sat together, sharing a moment of quiet reflection. They had come a long way since that fateful day when Karen first stopped to talk to John on the sidewalk. What had started as a chance encounter had blossomed into something none of them could have anticipated, a shared journey of growth, understanding, and redemption. For Karen, the transformation had been profound. Her once insular world of privilege and appearances now felt distant, like the memory of a life she had outgrown. Through her work with veterans and the homeless, she had discovered a sense of purpose that gave her life new meaning. But it wasn't just about the people she helped, it was about the person she had become. Empathy, once an abstract concept, had become the foundation of her existence. She had learned to see people as more than their circumstances, to look beyond the surface and recognize the humanity in everyone she met. Karen's non-profit, Bridges of Hope, had grown rapidly, drawing support from unexpected places. Her story had inspired others to take action, sparking conversations about systemic issues and the importance of community support. Yet, Karen knew the real change started with individuals, with people like John and Sarah, whose lives had shown her the power of resilience and forgiveness. John had found something he thought he'd lost forever, a sense of dignity and purpose. His apartment was small but comfortable, a place where he could hang photos of Sarah and display the mementos of his military service with pride. He had started volunteering at Bridges of Hope, sharing his story with others who were struggling. His words carried a weight born of experience, and his calm demeanor reassured those who felt trapped by their circumstances. Through his work, John had found a new way to serve, a way to give back to the community that had given him a second chance. He was no longer just surviving, he was living. And every time he saw Sarah sitting in the audience at one of his talks, her quiet support a constant presence, he felt a flicker of hope that their relationship would continue to heal. Sarah, too, had undergone a transformation. Her journey hadn't been easy, years of pain and resentment didn't disappear overnight. But the more time she spent with her father, the more she began to see the man he was becoming. She still carried scars from the past, but she had come to understand that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting, it was about choosing to move forward. Her relationship with Karen had also grown into an unexpected source of strength. The two women had formed a bond through their shared desire to help John and others like him, and Sarah had found in Karen a mentor and friend. Together, they worked on outreach programs and events, their combined efforts creating ripples of change in the community. Officer Rodriguez watched their progress from afar, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. He hadn't done much, just a few small gestures, a few words of encouragement, but seeing how those moments had cascaded into something far greater filled him with hope. It was a reminder that kindness didn't need to be grand to be meaningful. Sometimes, it was the smallest acts that created the biggest impacts. Rodriguez often thought about the countless others he passed on his daily patrols, people who, like John, felt invisible in a world that moved too fast to notice them. He made it his mission to slow down, to listen, to offer help where he could. He knew he couldn't save everyone, but he also knew that wasn't the point. Change started with one person at a time. The park had quieted as the afternoon gave way to evening, the golden light of the setting sun casting a warm glow over the scene. Karen, John, and Sarah sat together, their laughter mingling with the distant hum of the city. For a moment, the weight of their journeys seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of peace and possibility. Karen glanced at John and Sarah, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think change was something that happened to other people. But now I know it starts with us, with the choices we make every day." John nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's not easy," he said. "But it's worth it. Every step, every small victory, it all adds up." Sarah smiled, reaching for her father's hand. "And we don't have to do it alone," she added. "That's the most important part." The three of them sat in comfortable silence, the bond they had forged through their struggles now unbreakable. They knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but they also knew they had the strength to navigate it together. In the days and weeks that followed, the ripples of their journey continued to spread. Karen's non-profit gained traction, inspiring others to take action in their own communities. John's story became a beacon of hope for those who felt lost, a reminder that redemption was always possible. And Sarah, with her newfound sense of purpose, became an advocate in her own right, working tirelessly to support families affected by homelessness and trauma. Their story wasn't just about overcoming hardship, it was about the power of connection, the importance of seeing and valuing one another, and the profound impact of empathy. It was a testament to the idea that change, no matter how small, could spark a chain reaction that transformed lives. As the sun set over the city, the three of them parted ways, each heading home with a renewed sense of purpose. And somewhere in the distance, Officer Rodriguez smiled to himself, knowing that the small act of kindness he'd offered John had blossomed into something extraordinary. In the end, it wasn't just about redemption or growth, it was about the enduring power of human connection. And as Karen walked home under the fading light, she realized that the story they had written together was only the beginning.